Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Maria Foscarinis. She's a former Wall Street lawyer who left corporate law back in the 80s to fight homelessness. And she's got a new book, End Housing for All, the Fight to End Homelessness in America. And it seems like an appropriate topic for right now. It seems like it says that you left corporate law in the 80s, and I remember the 80s and remember kind of the first wave of homelessness, and it seems like we've come back to that. What's going on?
Well, you're absolutely right. There was a big first wave of homelessness in the 80s that coincided and really was triggered by the Reagan administration and all the cuts to the social safety net that they and he promoted. There have been, so that's the first wave. That first wave has continued. That didn't end, but it's been added to. So following the foreclosure crisis in the 2008, and going forward, foreclosure crisis also triggered another wave almost as large as the original one. A lot more people became homeless, many for the first time. So we've got these waves, and we have been the country has been responding, or government has been responding, but it's not nearly enough. So it just keeps getting worse. The causes remain unaddressed. The cuts to housing in particular that were initiated during the Reagan era have never been replaced. So those cuts have remained. Some housing has been restored, but not nearly enough to make up the gap. So things have been just getting worse because the causes have not been addressed.
And there's a slogan now, housing is a human right. And it's interesting because I'm about 20 years into my career. And when I first started, people kept saying, well, David, you need to look at housing as a social justice issue. And I'm like, well, it's complicated. There's environmental issues, there's growth issues. But really, in the last 20 years, I've seen the urgency of housing as a social justice issue and as a needed human right. Can you kind of explain why housing should be seen in that light, in that framing?
Great question. Yes, it should be. In fact, it is a human right according to international human rights law and norms. And the documents that the US, in fact, had a leadership role in creating. But it has not been seen that way in the United States for a long time. And that's really, in a way, the root of this, that housing is a human right. Advocates have been pushing, I and other advocates have been pushing for this, for it to be seen that way for over 20 years. I'm glad that you have seen this, and the fact that it's something that you're aware of means that there has been some success in moving this forward. So seeing housing as a human right, acknowledging that it is in fact a human right, means that government would have to ensure that there are policies in place that actually allow everyone to have a safe, decent place to live. Right now, that's not the case. Right now, this is all driven by the market. If you have money and can afford the growing cost of housing, you're okay. If you don't, then you're not. And there's nothing you can do about that. This is the basic problem. Housing is something that everybody needs. It's a basic human need. Everyone needs a place to live. But it's treated in our country and other not just our country, but certainly here, it's treated as a commodity. It's something to buy, it's something to trade on the stock market, something to profit from. And that is actually a trend that has really gotten worse over the past really since the foreclosure crisis. So over the past 15 years or so, there's been an acceleration in the treatment of housing as a commodity. Something for investment, private equity is now playing a growing role in purchasing housing, in building housing, even for the purpose of profit. So when we treat housing that way, that means that there will be losers, and there are now a lot of losers in the effort to get housing.
And I was going to ask, where have we fallen by the wayside in terms of providing housing for everyone?
Well, there are a lot of people who simply can't afford housing. I mean, homelessness is the extreme tip of a very large iceberg. And the fact is that a lot of people are struggling to afford housing, to afford their mortgage, to pay the rent. There's a growing number of people who are spending over 50% of their income simply for housing, and that leaves very little to spare. So right now, so there used to be there used to be programs funded by the federal government to make sure that people could afford housing. This was never guaranteed, but there were programs like federal low-income housing programs that were part of the New Deal that helped people afford housing. Right now, only 1 in 4 of people who are poor enough to qualify actually receives help under these federal programs. That's probably about to get a lot worse if the budget cuts that this current administration is proposing actually go through. But right now, just 1 in 4 waiting lists for housing assistance are years long in cities around the country. There's something called housing vouchers that is supposed to make up the difference between rent and income. And people just simply can't get those vouchers. Sometimes, even if they're finally lucky enough to be able to get them, they can't use them because landlords won't accept them. There used to be something called public housing in this country. This has been massively defunded, allowed to deteriorate, and no new units are even allowed to be built now since the late 1990s. So it's not just fallen by the wayside, it's been pushed over the edge of a cliff in the United States, and these are the consequences.
And from your perspective, is homelessness primarily a housing issue, or is it more than that?
Well, it's fundamentally a housing issue. Um, of course, some people need more than housing. Housing is the key, though. So, yes, there are homeless people who have mental health issues or who might have substance abuse issues or have other issues that need to be addressed. But without the housing, it's almost impossible to address these issues. That's why there's something called Housing First, which is a very successful program. It's a programmatic approach to helping people who are unhoused. And it offers housing, it provides housing and offers services that people may need. But it's a mistake to think, well, that means this is not really a housing issue. It's a mental health issue or it's a substance abuse issue. No, it's fundamentally a housing issue. You need housing. Then you have to also consider what else you might need. And
Um,
I can also say that the proportions are not so maybe 30% of people who are experiencing homelessness also have mental health issues. So it's a significant percentage, but not the majority. A lot of people have mental health issues who are housed. So I think we really need to focus on that housing piece.
And talk a little bit about your journey. How do you go from being a Wall Street lawyer to somebody who leaves corporate law and then goes to fight homelessness?
Well, I, like many people, I think, went to law school with the idea that it would allow me to make a positive impact in the world. And when I got out of law school, there were not a lot of opportunities for that. There were many opportunities to enter corporate law. So I took that route and I don't regret it. It was a good experience. I learned a lot, made important connections, but I also was always looking for a way to do more. I volunteered for a pro bono case representing homeless families, and I was really inspired by that. The families, I was in New York at the time, and the families were living in a otherwise wealthy suburb of New York City, and they were really struggling and they were doing everything possible to house themselves and not succeeding. And they were being denied emergency shelter. I took on that project, working on that case for a couple of years. This was in the early 1980s, so it was at the very beginning when homelessness was first exploding and a lot of families were being affected. So I entered kind of advocacy on this issue at that time, that moment of explosion. And I just, the opportunity arose to go to DC to try to get the federal government to respond. And I took it. And I won't say I never looked back, but I certainly don't regret that choice. It was really an opportunity and a privilege to do something that was and is meaningful and that has had an impact.
And tell us about your book.
So the book is about homelessness and its evolution, starting in the 1980s and continuing to this day. It looks at some of the deliberate policy decisions which created and led to the crisis. So it's often said, at the time of Reagan's mantra was homelessness is a choice. And the book kind of really argues that homelessness is a choice. It's a choice made by policymakers. It's a choice made by the policies that this country has adopted. And in the book, I trace the evolution of those policies and their impact on people and their lives. So I start with it's really not chronological, but it does address the early 80s, the start of the crisis, what happens when you allow a crisis to remain unaddressed, which is increasing criminalization, which is what is the prevalent response now to homelessness, just try to make it a crime to live on the streets. And then the struggle for housing as a human right. And there is a lot of activism now across the country. We had been working on pushing housing as a human right at the federal level, had been making some progress with the Biden administration. Now, of course, everything is completely different, but yet the advocacy at the local level continues, and it's making impact and having some success. So I tell stories of people who are and have experienced homelessness. Many of the people I've met over my years of work on this issue, but I also interweave the policies to show the impact of those policies on people's lives. It's not a hopeless book. book. I finished writing the book last year before the November elections. I had to go back and make some changes after the elections because it had ended on a more hopeful note. But I still have hope. It's just, it's going to take a longer time and a lot more fighting in order to overcome some of the terribly destructive policies coming out of the current administration.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about the criminalization of homelessness because now I'm out in California. Unfortunately, we're the homeless capital of probably the world, I would say. And so, one of the big things, even among kind of lefties, is this idea of clearing the encampments and the idea that, oh, clearing the encampments is the best way to go about doing this because of the nuisance and the crime and everything. And of course, I'm sure you're well aware of the court case from last year that kind of opened the door for this. But basically, this becomes a revolving door, right? You clear somebody's encampment, they're not going to disappear. So they got to go somewhere, and we don't have enough housing and we don't have enough shelters. So what happens? Well, they move from one place to another, and that causes a lot of problems for them. And I keep trying to convince people that, somebody has to go somewhere, and they're like, well, they can just arrest them and, keep them in jail, which is actually much more expensive than permanent supportive housing. So I'm throwing a lot out there, but I kind of want to hear your reaction to some of this stuff.
Well, I agree completely. I think you laid it out exactly right. I mean, that's what I would have said. People have to be somewhere, and just simply making it a crime for people to live in public is not going to do anything. It's expensive. It costs more to arrest and pursue people through the criminal justice system than it does to house them. It doesn't make any sense. The bottom line is that no one wants people to be living in public. No one is advocating for this. That's why the campaign that my organization started some years ago is called Housing Not Handcuffs. It's not just about fighting the handcuffs piece. It's not just about fighting criminalization. That has to happen. Criminalization is wrong. It's wrong to punish someone for not having a place to live. But that's not enough. You also have to fight for something, and that something is housing. And simply criminalizing people is not going to solve any problem. It will just make it worse. So it's expensive, but it's counterproductive. People will just move to some other public place. If you quote, clear an encampment, they'll create another one. And it will make it harder for people to get housed. With a criminal record, potentially, it will become that much harder to find a job, to find housing, even to find shelter. So it's a policy that makes no sense. The Supreme Court decision from last June was a terrible disappointment. It really rolled back some court victories, which were promising, and just really opened the door for cities and states. Increasingly, states are adopting these laws as well to criminalize people who are homeless. Since that decision in Grants Pass, over 150 new ordinances have been enacted. So it's just not productive, and it's not an issue just in California. I know California gets a lot of attention, but homelessness is really a national problem. It may be more visible in California, but it is certainly, and certainly California has very high housing costs, but a lot of places do. And this is an issue that is affecting the entire country and has to be addressed in a way that actually solves the problem.
So let's talk a little bit about drugs. And part of the issue, I think, is that the rise of the fentanyl crisis has coincided with the rise of homelessness in kind of the second wave. Um, how how do you address the drug issue?
Drugs are a problem for a lot of Americans. They are not exclusively a problem for homeless Americans. They're a problem in general that has to be addressed. And it's too bad that it has become in the public, or at least in a public narrative, it's become caught up with homelessness in a way as if people who are homeless are unusually affected by drugs. I mean, it is true that sometimes drug use can lead to homelessness if it leads to job loss or eviction, but that's not what's driving it. And it also is true that sometimes being homeless can lead to drug use because it can be a coping mechanism. It can be a coping mechanism if you're out on the street and you see no way out. But that's, again, not the driving cause. I think it's important to stay focused on why people are homeless, how they came to be homeless, and how we can help them not be. And again, housing is essential. If you have a drug problem, you're not going to kick it by staying on the street. You need a place to live, a stable place to live, and where you can also get help with your drug problem. So I just it yes, it in a way it kind of confuses the issue because it takes us away from that key point that homelessness requires housing to be solved.
Yeah, and I think, you alluded to it, but there's a lot of data out there that shows that homelessness makes drug problems worse. Drug problems don't necessarily lead to homelessness. And I think people have that backwards in their mind.
Right. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about homelessness, and I don't really blame the public. I think there's a public narrative. There's a narrative that's launched during the Reagan years. I go back to that because I think that really is critical. Reagan talked about homeless people choosing to be homeless. He said, well, homelessness is a choice. It's a lifestyle choice, as if people just decide they want to, move out of their house and live on the street. And that's really destructive as a narrative for understanding this issue. When we talk about drugs and homelessness, again, it's like, well, it's it's their own fault. They're taking drugs. That's why they're homeless. And so they don't deserve any help. Just leave them out there, just arrest them. That's wrong. It's a narrative that maybe can be convenient for some people. It justifies things like clearing encampments, criminalizing people, arresting them. But that's not the way to solve a problem.
Yeah. And, I think you hit the nail on the head. There are people that seem to believe that we can arrest our way out of this problem, and we really can't.
Exactly. And I should say also, to be clear, that this is a bipartisan approach. It's not limited to Republicans. Democrats also, not all, but certainly there have been Democrats who have been pushing these kinds of measures. Gavin Newsom is a good example of one such person. And it's just a very harmful narrative.
Yeah, unfortunately, I see people on the left doing the same thing as people on the right. Sometimes they couch it in a little bit milder terms, sometimes not. Um, but in your book, you give a bunch of narratives and tell a bunch of stories. And I know we're kind of running out of time here, but maybe share one or two that just stand out in your mind.
Sure. So one story that stands out for me involves a man named Danny in Denver. Um, Somebody who um, is a native Denverite. He grew up in Denver. He got married. He had a job. He supported his family. He got divorced. And following his divorce, he was no longer able, he also lost his job. He was no longer able to support himself in the same way. He moved in with his parents. Um, when his parents died, it turned out Danny was not on the lease. So he was not able to stay in their home. They were renting. So he had no place to go. And he ended up on the street in Denver, living outside under a tarp in the snow, in the cold, in the winter. He tried to get shelter. The shelters had a curfew. He had a job working an overnight shift, stocking shelves, and couldn't often stay in the shelter because that would cause him to miss his work. And so he's living outside and starts experiencing pain in his limbs. He suspects he has frostbite, tries to get it treated, and gets turned away just with pain medications when he goes to the ER. So Danny ends up having one of his legs amputated below the knee and 5 of his toes amputated from his remaining leg. And this is filmed. He wanted it to be filmed. He was filmed. There's an advocacy group, a mutual aid group in Denver that was trying to help him. They came with him to the hospital. They filmed him. He ended up on TV, local TV, with this, the results of his amputation just showing this. He wanted to get his story out. He talks about in the clip about how housing is the solution and how simply trying to clear these encampments like the one he was living in is not the way to do it. And it's just, I talked to him as I was writing my book, and I interviewed him, and it was just so enraging. I mean, you can say it's heartbreaking, it is, but it's also enraging that this is allowed to happen in the United States of America, and a country that has so much, and yet people are just people who are really trying to get out of this situation. They are allowed to just live in public. They have to give up their limbs, and just horrifying. So that was a story that really stuck with me.
So as we wrap up here, how can people make an impact?
So people can make an impact by using their voice. I think this is really important, and there's a lot of ways that people can get involved. I mean, there are a lot of people who volunteer. They volunteer in shelters and soup kitchens. That's all important. But it's also very important to volunteer and become an advocate, to call your representative in government, whoever that might be, at the local level, the city level, at the state level, at the federal level, and say, housing is a human right. We want you to support funding for housing, not criminalization. Make this case. That is the most important thing I think that anyone can do, is be an advocate. Use your voice, make change, find out in your community who is working on these issues. Can you help? Can you be involved with them? And use your voice.
Well, that's all we have time for. The book is Housing for All, The Fight to End Homelessness in America. And I see this goes on sale in June, which is in the future as we record this, but probably in the past. when this show launches. We've been talking with Maria Foscarinis. She's nationally recognized legal advocate for homeless rights. Homelessness is a major issue, one of the issues that the Vanguard covers extensively, and it's just a tragedy that people don't seem to understand that until we get enough housing, until we get affordable housing, until we get housing security, we're not going to solve this problem. We're certainly not going to solve it by clearing encampments or criminalizing homelessness. So thank you, Maria, for joining us.
My pleasure, David. Thank you for hosting me.
This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.